I would like to welcome recording in progress, so I guess that's our signal. Welcome to Access to Migration and Integration Funding for Cities, what can and cannot be achieved within the new European Union budget. I'm very happy that we have a very stellar panel with us today. I think it will be a very interesting discussion, and I've also looking very much forward to the questions of the audience. I'm hoping you are all doing well, and I'm also happy to see that it's such a transnational European audience, which is what we need in these times, I think, and it also shows that this topic is of wide interest to different institutions, to different actors and cities all over Europe. Just some technical details. We will provide simultaneous translation into 4 different languages, so English, German, French, and Italian. And you can choose the language you want to follow on the bottom right, clicking on the sign globe. As I said, we are also very much looking forward to your questions, so feel free to use the Q&A section at the bottom of the webinar window during the discussion, so you don't have to wait until we get to the Q&A. You can post your questions throughout the discussion, but we will only take them at the end. And we encourage you to use the chat function anyways to share relevant publications, projects, initiatives that are interesting to the audience. And we also have a technical moderator, which is Alina. So if you face any kind of technical difficulties, please write to her. And last but not least, I'm Malisa Zobel. I will moderate through this event today. I used to lead the Municipal Integration and Development Initiative for 3 years, and I co-wrote, for transparency reasons, I co-wrote the policy paper, which some of the recommendations we will also discuss today, but my colleague and co-author Johannes Krabbe will present this later. And we are very, very happy that Damian Boeselager is with us today. He's a member of the European Parliament. He also told me he has to leave for a very important debate after his introductory remarks. And we co-organized this event together, and very happy to have some introductory remarks from him, which I give you the word now. Thank you.
Thanks, Malisa, and sorry that I have to leave. It's about we're talking about money, so I can even tell you where I'm going, because I'm actually heading out, since I'm still the spokesperson for the Greens EFA for the recovery money, which is these 750 billion euros. We're having a debate on the use and the implementation of this money later on with the Commission, so I have to head over there. But I didn't want to miss this chance to talk to you, because I mean, for me this is a crucial topic, and I tell you also why. I mean, being now, negotiating some of these EU asylum files, and many of you have been following asylum files for much longer than I have, or the European asylum system, we all know how tricky it is to get all our governments, especially our interior ministers, but also our heads of state and government, around one table to actually agree on any system. Yeah? And this is also due to a very poisoned debate on the topic. It's very difficult to get to systematic answers rather than ideological ones. So I feel very often, the light is even worse. Let's see. We very often see that it's very difficult because it's so poisonous, and that's why I'm constantly looking for more positive ways at looking at the narrative also around asylum. And I have to say, I mean, one way to do this is to look more into labor migration and talk about the positive sides of that. But I'm not a big fan of that, because it's mixing up 2 worlds, the labor migration world and the asylum world. So, but if you look within the asylum world, I think the best example of how to have a more positive discussion about asylum is really when you look at the local level. And I'm very happy that the Greens EFA have always made that their priority. If you look at, I think, a paper that we wrote almost 2 years ago, a position paper of the Greens EFA on the new asylum pact before it came out, it very much builds on the voluntary solidarity capacities of the local level. And I think this should really be a part of the solution when we look forward. And I'm very happy that you now try to also understand what are the capacities, the resources, the potential ways of actually incentivizing good integration programs, good asylum programs from the local perspective. It would make me very happy. We have been trying to, on the European level, basically build this into new legislative proposals. So, for example, I work on the crisis and force majeure mechanism, which is basically saying, like, what should we do if 2015 repeats itself in a way? How can we maybe in this specific case of a crisis, if you want to call it like that, I prefer the term emergency. If you have an emergency, how can you, at least in this case, maybe ensure mandatory solidarity? So actually asking, countries to take up people. We also try to strengthen the role of local levels much more in this context. My original idea was to say that basically there would be some form of a, voluntary pool that could be completely, put forward by willing cities and municipalities, but there are legal issues because of the competences of the member states, which make this a very difficult endeavor. But I think we should get there at some point, even though it's not this way around. But this time around. But we are definitely trying to do that, and also definitely incentivize also the funding side on that. The other thing that we have been trying to do also with the Greens, if I started this with my office, is to just register all these cities and municipalities that have already said that they would accept asylum seekers from our borders. And you can find that, I'll post this in the chat once I'm done talking, on a homepage where, we all know all these NGOs that have basically tried to convince certain cities and cities and municipalities to become welcoming communities, Seebrücke, for example, in Germany, but others in other member states as well. And we didn't do the work they did, but we put them all on one homepage so that you can actually see what kind of a welcoming continent we already are. It's really quite impressive. There are more than 1,000 communities and cities that are easily willing to take up people, which could already, relax the situation at our borders very much. I see my team just posted it also in the chat. So with this, I'm very much looking forward to understanding a bit more also in detail, and my team will also stay to take note what kind of funding capacities and resources you believe are currently there from an expert perspective and from a practitioner's perspective. And I think we should definitely stay in contact and try to really unlock a bit the issues of this asylum system by showing this positive narrative and showing what can already be done and what kind of programs actually help the people on the ground so much more than all the at parts stuck narratives and discussions on the European level. That would be my big hope, and then we can fight on to try to reduce suffering and increase let's say the positive examples of integration and asylum. Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you so much, Damian Boeselager. Very, very important issues that you raised. And I think this is exactly one of the focal points that we also have, this kind of like positive side to the story among all the negative things that evolve around migration and asylum issues. And cities are really the central actors upholding fundamental European values like democracy and diversity. And they provide reception and shelter for migrants and refugees. And they're really on the forefront. And I think a lot of positive news these days are actually coming from the local level. And even in these like difficult political contexts, many cities join forces, create networks, and work with civil society to support integration measures and advocate for resettlement of refugees to Europe, or also relocation issues. But at the same time, and that's the topic of today, they often lack the necessary funding to really properly welcome and integrate newcomers. And we will discuss this maybe, but in this sense, I think cities or city-states are also a bit different to member states, because they're actually doing the lion's share of integration work, but they also don't really have a seat at the table. And so one of the aims of the discussion today is to discuss what kind of, basically where we are and what kind of funding sources can be used. And for a long time at the NGO where I used to work and where the policy paper comes from, the HUMBOLDT-VIADRINA Governance Platform, together with our president, Gesine Schwan, we developed this idea of an EU integration and development fund that would actually reimburse cities for the cost of reception and integration, and at the same time provide the same amount for these cities for their own municipal development. And this basically also to counter these negative stereotypes and these negative narratives about welcoming migrants and refugees, by showing that this can be a win-win situation for the whole local community, and that's about community building. But before I talk too much, because we are already a bit behind in time, I would like to hand over to my colleague Johannes Krabbe and co-author of the policy paper, who will present some of the key findings. And afterwards, I will, of course, introduce all our panelists, and we will open the discussion among the panelists. And we will finish with an open round of questions from the audience. That's more or less our roadmap. And now handing over to Johannes. Thank you.
Thank you, Marlisa. Hello, everyone from Berlin, from the Office of HUMBOLDT-VIADRINA Governance Platform. I'll just share my screen with you to walk you through some of the key findings that we've published in the policy brief that Marlisa and I have just finalized at the end of last year. What I'm trying to do is to give a very brief overview of the different funds that are available for cities in the field. And secondly, I want to look at what opportunities and obstacles there are currently to be faced for cities when they want to access these funds. And lastly, I'll just briefly pinpoint you to some of the recommendations that we also made in the policy brief. Looking at what funds are available, we primarily look at direct funds, so funds that are directly managed by the EU Commission. First and foremost, obviously, it's the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, short AMIF, which is run by DG Home, which has a so-called thematic facility, which covers a total of 3.6 billion euros, of which 5% at least will be earmarked for funds for local and regional authorities. So this will be funds that are specifically dedicated to municipalities all over Europe in the field of migration and integration. Just after we published our policy brief, the information on the new calls came out for the upcoming year. And in 2022, there will be a call on integration and inclusion at regional and local level. So there will be one dedicated call just on that particular topic. And I'm sure Anita Vella from DG Home will be able to say something about that later on. Another very interesting direct fund is the European Urban Initiative, which is a fund that comes from the European Regional Fund. So it's coordinated by DG Regio and has a total of 450 million euro capacity, and is a fund that's specifically dedicated to cities all over Europe that want to introduce innovative actions, capacity building, knowledge building, and so forth. It does not only target integration measures and activities, but these can also be covered by the funds in the EUI. And then I put down here just for you briefly, I'm not going to talk about them, 3 other important funds in the field. That's the European Social Fund, ESF+, Erasmus+, and the SURF program. They are much broader programs that do not only talk about and cover integration, but that can be very useful, and especially Erasmus and the Citizens Equalities program are directly managed and also have regular funds that are directly targeted to local authorities. With that in mind, what are current opportunities and obstacles for cities that we discussed? First and foremost, what's good to see is that the central role of the local level is widely recognized, which we, for example, also see in the fact that now there is an earmarked amount for local authorities in the AMIF program. What's a positive thing certainly is that the AMIF now falls under the Common Provision Regulation, which is, just to make it very short, sort of like an overarching regulation that regulates different kinds of EU funds. And part of the Common Provision Regulation is the partnership principle, which mandates that local authorities have to be involved in all stages of the funding process. So that's a great step also for the AMIF. Another great development is a number of innovative new programs like the Inclusion Partnership, which I think will also come up in the discussion later on. It's an attempt to bring together EU Commission, other actors and cities to enhance municipalities' access to different kinds of funds. Maybe on the downside, talking about obstacles, we still lack a number of funds. It's still not that much when it comes to direct funds available for cities and municipalities. There's still cities that would like to do more, but find it difficult to find adequate funds, which also refers to the second point here, talking about timelines and application procedures. They do remain relatively complex, and we always hear, especially from smaller municipalities and cities, that it's very complicated to find your way through the EU application procedure. Bigger cities often have more administrative resources to go through that procedure, but for smaller cities in particular, this can be very complicated. And lastly, As much as there is the partnership principle, it remains unclear to what extent local and regional authorities are involved in the programming phase, especially of these kind of funds, where we would wish for more involvement of cities and municipalities. And that directly leads me to some of the recommendations that we make in our policy brief. There's 5 of which in the paper itself. I'm just going to talk you briefly through 3 different ones. First of all, we suggest to introduce a monitoring mechanism for the partnership principle so that we could really make sure that local and regional authorities would be stronger involved in the whole process of administrating EU funds, starting from programming, going through implementation, and of course, ending with evaluation. Secondly, we suggest that the resettlement and relocation funds that are now part of the new Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund should be forwarded directly to the municipalities that are receiving the asylum seekers in the first place or in the end, because these are the ones that are doing most of the work when it comes to that. And lastly, and Marlisa has briefly touched upon that in her introduction, in the medium term, of course, we suggest the introduction of an integration and development fund, which would really, well, be a more holistic approach to combine integration expenditures with urban development and bring that together. That is just 3 short recommendations. If you want to also read more from the other recommendations we make, and of course, read more in detail of what we've had to say in the policy brief, you're very welcome to download the policy brief. It's available on our website, governance-platform.org. And with that, I just hand back to the moderator, Marlisa.
Yes, thank you so much, Johannes, for presenting the central key findings of the policy brief, which probably provides some food for discussion. I don't know if I can say that. So I usually I'm not very good with the sayings, especially if I translate German ones into English. Anyways, let's jump right into our discussion. But before, I would like, of course, to introduce our panelists. And very unusually, I will start with a man first, mainly because he's first on my notes, Klaus Haprast. He is city councillor of Grenoble in France, where he oversees European affairs, Alpine policies and cultural heritage. And he was elected in 2014 as a city councillor as the member of a Green Left team led by the mayor, Eric Piolle. I hope I pronounce his name correctly. And previously, thank you. Previously, he was the vice chair of the Grenoble Metropolitan Council in charge of innovation, sports, and European affairs. And then we have Anita Vella. She's currently head of the unit in the European Commission's Director General for Migration and Home Affairs, the unit Home C2, which is responsible for legal pathways and integration, so right on topic. She has started her career in the Commission already in 2005 as a desk officer in the Director General for Maritime Affairs and Fisheries, where she occupied different positions, and she moved on to the Director General for Employment and Social Policies as deputy head of unit between 2014 and 19, and is now the head of unit for Migration and Home Affairs, as I said. Very happy to have you here. Then we have Niels Tübing. He has been working in the field of civic integration of migrants and refugees for the city of Amsterdam in the Netherlands since 2009. He currently works both as a senior policy advisor at the Department of Asylum Status Holders and as a senior advisor on social affairs at the International Office. He has been very active on the European level already since 2016 with regards to the topics of migration and integration. He has worked in different contexts with the European Commission. And since 2020, he's the chair of the Eurocities Working Group for Migration and Integration. So the European level, a very important association of cities. He will probably tell us more about this during the discussion. And he also told me that he's very immersed in music, wearing his rock and roll roots on his civil servant sleeves. I didn't want to miss to mention that. Then we have Emilia Postolake. She's a European Affairs Officer with the Council of European Development Bank. And in this capacity, she has She represents the bank in European technical and policy fora and works with potential clients and the European Commission on identifying solutions and defining projects that may be financed by the European Union. And the Council of Europe Development Bank collaborates within the European Urban Agenda Partnership on inclusion of migrant and refugees, and is thereby a very important stakeholder. And we're very happy to have you here as well, Emilia Boeselager. And then last but not least, but she will be our first speaker to give the first input, Antje Grother. She has been a member of the European Committee of the Regions since 2020, and she is the committee's rapporteur on the new Pact on Migration and Asylum and the Action Plan on Integration and Inclusion. And she's also the vice president of the city-state of Bremen in Germany, and of which she has been a member since 2011. She is a lawyer by profession, and she's currently the chair of the Legal Affairs Committee and vice chair of the Committee of Federal, European and International Affairs and for Development Cooperation. I'm very happy and very impressed to have such a very good panel with so many experts for our discussion. And I would like to start to jump right into the discussion by asking Antje Grother, why is this direct EU funding for cities so important? As you were the rapporteur of the European Committee of the Regions for the new Pact of Migration and Asylum, and this discussion about direct access for funding has been around for a long time. Why is this demand so central also for committee members, for the Committee of the Region members? And what are the experiences also that other cities have shared of local and regional authorities in using and accessing funds at the European level? Thank you.
Thank you, Malisa. Dear colleagues, I'm going to speak German from now on, so the interpreters can just change the language they use. For me, it's easier to speak in German. Vielen Dank für die Einladung zur Diskussion. Ich freue mich sehr, dass ich heute dabei sein kann. Das ist für mich eine ganz besondere Freude, weil es mir Gelegenheit gibt, auch nochmal über die Stellungnahme des Ausschusses der Regionen zu reden. Und von dem, was eben vorgestellt worden ist aus dem Policy-Brief, kann ich nur sagen, dass ich die Empfehlungen absolut unterstütze und mich sehr freue, dass die vorgelegt worden sind, weil sie sich sehr weitgehend decken mit dem, was der Ausschuss der Regionen tatsächlich beschlossen hat. Ich kann nicht über Geld reden, bevor ich nicht über den Inhalt der Vorschläge der Europäischen Kommission rede. Deswegen möchte ich damit zunächst anfangen. Wir unterstützen grundsätzlich alle Regionen das Ziel der Europäischen Kommission, ein umfassendes und zuverlässiges System zur Steuerung von Migration zu entwickeln. Und dazu gehört auch die Migration von Geflüchteten, die auf europäischen Werten, insbesondere den Werten Solidarität und Würde basiert. Das ist für uns ganz wichtig in diesem Zusammenhang. Eine unserer Hauptsorgen ist jedoch, dass die lokale und regionale Dimension im Pakt nicht ausreichend berücksichtigt wurde, obwohl dies sowohl für die Notfallplanung und das Krisenmanagement als auch für eine erfolgreiche langfristige Integration unbedingt erforderlich ist. Irreguläre Migration erzeugt einen erheblichen Druck auf die Regionen und Städte an den EU-Außengrenzen. Deshalb fordern wir eine wirksame Solidarität mit diesen Regionen, um den Druck auf sie und ihre jeweiligen Mitgliedstaaten zu verringern. Dabei muss man wissen, dass die Situation in den Mitgliedstaaten selbst völlig unterschiedlich ist. Und die Tatsache, dass einige Regionen am Rande Europas ganz stark betroffen sind, heißt nicht, dass der Mitgliedstaat als Ganzer ebenso stark betroffen ist. Und deswegen sind die Diskussionen in den Regionen auch unterschiedlich als auf nationaler Ebene. Wir fordern aber vor allen Dingen einen besseren Schutz für die Schwachen, weniger Zeit in Aufnahmezentren an den Grenzen der EU und die uneingeschränkte Achtung der Grundrechte von Migranten. Wir begrüßen den Wunsch der Europäischen Kommission, sichere Wege nach Europa zu schaffen und fordern die Kommission und die Mitgliedstaaten auf, die Neuansiedlungsprogramme weiter auszubauen und mehr humanitäre Aufnahmeprogramme einzurichten. Und hier spätestens kommen dann die Regionen auch tatsächlich massiv ins Spiel. Wir begrüßen auch den Aktionsplan für Integration und Inklusion und seine Anerkennung der Rolle der lokalen und regionalen Gebietskörperschaften. Wir hoffen, dass dank der Integrationspartnerschaft zwischen dem ADR und der Europäischen Kommission wir in der Lage sein werden, die Maßnahmen, die auf regionale und lokale Aktivitäten abzielen, besser und umfassender umzusetzen. einschließlich auch Schulen, Schulungen und Informationsaustausch für Mitglieder unseres Netzwerks Städte und Regionen für die Integration von Migranten. Es handelt sich dabei um 158 gleichgesinnte Städte und Regionen, die bewährte Verfahren austauschen, voneinander lernen und zu einem besseren Verständnis von Integrationsdaten auf lokaler Ebene beitragen. Ein weiterer wichtiger Punkt ist die Bedeutung der Bekämpfung von Desinformation über Integration und Migration durch die Veröffentlichung konkreter Fakten und Zahlen, um Diskriminierung, Vorurteilen, Rassismus und Fremdenfeindlichkeit entgegenzuwirken. Wir haben die Bereitschaft vieler lokaler und regionaler Gebietskörperschaften erlebt, sich aktiv an der Aufnahme und Integration gefährdeter Migrantinnen und Migranten zu beteiligen. Aber ihnen fehlt oft die Handlungsmöglichkeit oder ihnen fehlen die Mittel, um das zu tun. Aus diesem Grund ist es für uns besonders wichtig, die Notwendigkeit eines einfacheren und klaren Zugangs zu EU-Fördermitteln für Integration und Inklusion für lokale und regionale Gebietskörperschaften zu erlangen, auch auf makroregionaler Ebene. Unsere ADR-Stellungnahme sagt deswegen ganz klar, dass der AMIF, ist schon angesprochen worden, die Mittel des Asyl-, Migrations- und Integrationsfonds mobilisiert werden sollten, um die Mitgliedstaaten angemessen zu unterstützen, insbesondere diejenigen Mitgliedstaaten, die einem besonderen und unverhältnismäßigen Druck auf ihre Asyl- und Aufnahmesysteme ausgesetzt sind. Außerdem sollten den lokalen und regionalen Gebietskörperschaften angemessene Mittel zur Verfügung gestellt werden. Und die sollte die Möglichkeit einschließen, tatsächlich direkt aus dem AMIF Gelder beantragen und ausgeben zu können. Ich stimme auch der Empfehlung voll und ganz zu, dass lokale und regionale Gebietskörperschaften stärker in den Gestaltungs- und Umsetzungsprozess von EU-Mitteln einbezogen werden sollten, sowohl auf der Ebene der Mitgliedstaaten als auch auf EU-Ebene. Und schließlich wird kürzlich eine vom Europäischen Ausschuss der Regionen durchgeführte Studie mit dem Titel Territoriale Auswirkungen der Migration auf Regionen und Städte an den EU-Außengrenzen der Mittelmeeranrainer unterstützt. Wir haben dabei mit vielen Bürgermeisterinnen und Bürgermeistern und Regionalchefinnen und Chefs gesprochen. Und es gibt mehrere problematische Punkte. Wir kommen vor allen Dingen, ich kürze jetzt etwas ab, sonst wird es, glaube ich, zu lang, dass wir die Integrationsmittel in der Höhe der Finanzierung deutlich ausstocken müssen. Die Mittel werden vor Ort sehr effizient ausgegeben, aber wir haben das Problem, dass wir oft die Mittel nicht an die Bedürfnisse von Migrantinnen und Migranten anpassen können, weil sie so allgemein ausgeschrieben sind oder eben in Ausschreibungen, die nicht auf die konkrete Situation vor Ort passen. Ein weiteres Problem ist, dass die Mittel oft verzögert kommen. Sie können also nicht sofort eingesetzt werden, wenn sie vor Ort gebraucht werden, sondern es gibt einen langen Bewilligungsprozess, der oft auch noch über die Nationalebene hinaus gesteuert werden muss, wo es also Zwischenebenen gibt, die das Verfahren verlängern. Und insgesamt, und da komme ich jetzt zu meinem letzten Satz, ich sehe schon ein bisschen Unruhe, ist es wichtig, dass wir die lokalen und regionalen Gebietskörperschaften auf jeden Fall einbeziehen in die Gestaltung von Integrations- und Aufnahmepolitiken und auch in die finanziellen Gestaltungen, damit wir sicherstellen, dass die Gelder, die vor Ort sehr sinnvoll ausgegeben werden, dort, wo Integration und Aufnahme stattfinden, dass die Gelder dort auch zielgenau, passgenau angepasst werden können. Vielen Dank für Ihre Aufmerksamkeit. Ich freue mich auf die Diskussion.
Yes, thank you so much, Ms. Grother. You mentioned very important points, the differences between regions, so that there's not like a heterogeneous, that is a very heterogeneous discussion among regions and cities, even within member states, not only in Europe. And you also mentioned direct access and more flexibility to the AMIF. And the AMIF is managed, or at least parts of the direct part of the AMIF is managed by the European Commission. And I know, Ms. Vella, you are not responsible for the management of funds, but maybe you could still explain a bit more what are the funding opportunities for cities in the current AMIF. So AMIF is the Asylum, Migration and Integration Fund, for people who are not familiar with the abbreviation. And maybe what can you say about a specific call, or are you familiar with a specific call on integration and inclusion at the regional and local level, which seems to be targeted a bit more at local authorities? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Malisa, and allow me to say that I'm very happy to be part of this panel. And to hear, Damian Boeselager and his views and Antje Groter, I mean, I think we all share a little bit, the challenge and the pain of this narrative on asylum and migration, and that's why I think it's important, that we look at the integration and inclusion aspect, which is equally important. And this is why we also have this action plan on integration and inclusion. And this is a little bit, as we have been hearing, what drives our work, so the work of my unit and the colleagues for the next 7 years. And indeed, we have this partnership with the Committee of the Regions. I think this will be key, in how we take this forward in terms of dialogue and exchanges, even at our level with local and regional authorities. So definitely, this is very high on our agenda and on the agenda of Commissioner Johansson. This you should know. And then, so when it comes to the funding, indeed, so AMIF, there are quite a few opportunities. There is, I will not dwell on it, but you probably know, and I think it was mentioned before in the presentation, there's a big chunk of money that is managed in what we call shared management. So there are funds, and there are these programs that actually are being now drafted and put together by the member state authorities. And we have been, doing a lot of effort to ensure that when these are designed and put together, that this is not an exercise done at the central level, but there are proper mechanisms to make sure that necessary stakeholders are consulted, and possibly, joint committees to bring, the regional and local authorities on board from the start, and to properly, plan how these funds could be channeled to the regional level. So I know that this process is ongoing, and we will be, in the coming months, finalizing and adopting even officially these programs, these AMIF programs, as we call them, per member state. So that is one thing. Then comes what you call here direct funding, and indeed, I think it's an achievement, that there is this 5% earmarked, which will be, rolled out over the whole programming period. Yeah, so it's not just the first thematic facility, which we have already published and is out there, but this will be mirrored in the upcoming thematic facilities, which will be covering 2 years. Yeah, so this one is 2021, 2022. 2020, 2021, and the next one will go on for every 2 years. And this, yes, what we will be doing, to put this into practice, as you mentioned, is to launch a specific call. It will most probably be around March or April. And we are, looking at addressing in particular 4 topics. Yeah, so this is our reflection. So integration and inclusion at regional and local level, but also access to healthcare, improving digital skills among migrants, and lastly, community sponsorship schemes and complementary pathways. So we are looking at these 4 strands. The amount we are having is 25 million, and on all these topics, clearly, local and regional authorities can be key partners that should apply, or get together to make use of this possibility. And of course, specifically the topic on integration and inclusion at the regional and local level will specifically aim at supporting, the capacity building of the authorities. So how can they, better design and implement, these policies, what works well, what is needed, where to turn to, etc. Volunteering projects, mentoring, buddy systems. So we want to see, of course, what ideas are there, and we hope that once this call is out, We will as well do a little, info days session, because I heard before that very often authorities maybe do not have clarity, on how to access and what is expected, etc. So with my team, we are aware of that, and we will have a sort of information session there, and that's where I stop for the future. But maybe just to say one last thing, there are also a lot of projects that have been done and are ongoing. Looking at the figures, I think there are like 20 new transnational projects involving local and regional authorities, and I think it's also important, for all of us to look back and see what was learned there, what are the success stories, and talk about them, because in a way, it's good to access new funding, but I'm a believer, that we need to build on what we've done already, possibly scale it up, what worked, what didn't work, and share it with the others, because the environment we are working in, the change is constant, and we tend to forget the past, and it's good to look at the future, but I think we also need to build on the past. So I leave it at that for now.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mrs. Vella. I think you raised a lot of very important information, but also a lot of detail probably for the audience. So feel free to ask any kind of questions. If you didn't understand some of the details, I'm pretty sure the panelists will be happy to provide details. And I think there's also some very interesting points that you raised on accessibility by cities in the information, because that was one of the experiences that we had writing the policy brief as well, that there is a lot of things, but it's also not so easy to get the information. And if you don't have like dedicated time as we did, and to really like search deeply for the information, then it's a bit difficult, especially if the English skills are also not so good, etc. So that's just one point, but let's take this up for discussion later. Now I want to invite Emilia Boeselager from the Council of Europe Development Bank to also present what your institution is doing with regards to providing funding for integration and migration measures to cities. And yeah, I'm very happy to hear about your activities.
Thank you so much, Melissa, and good afternoon to everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for inviting us. I will now share my screen for a little bit of a graphic introduction to the bank. The bank was created in the wake of the Second World War. We are not a EU institution, but a European institution, in the sense that we were set up by 8 members of the Council of Europe. We now have 42 member states. You can see in very light yellow where we operate. We are based in France, in Paris, and we at the moment work along 3 lines of action: what we like to call inclusive growth, support for vulnerable groups, and environmental sustainability. Now, the support for vulnerable groups includes concrete projects in support of migrant integration and inclusion. We have started working directly with cities now it seems a long while ago. As you can see on this map, beginning with 2010, our support has gradually tried to respond to the cities and regions' need for social investments, including in support of migrant and refugee integration and inclusion. Now, if I were to talk about, to make this concrete a little bit and to think of 2 examples of the work that we do, I would like to pick 2 cities, Nuremberg and Malmö. The reason why I picked them is not because they are necessarily the places where we can find the best projects. I think we do excellent projects with all the cities that you can see here on the map, but rather that they are illustrative of the work that we've been trying to do in support of integration and inclusion. Concretely, in Malmö, we've got ongoing investments in school infrastructure. This was in response to an increase in school population, so primary and secondary education. Most of the increase was due to parents with what they call an ethnic background, so a foreign background, that would be migrants and refugees going to Sweden. And also to Malmö's decision to welcome unaccompanied minors. Now, because the unaccompanied minors needed additional support, not only in getting the language right, but in getting accustomed to the new culture, to feeling at home and to develop a sense of belonging, the bank has decided to allocate a grant to the city of Malmö to support such extracurricular activities for the unaccompanied minors that they decided to receive through mostly resettlement schemes. The grant was recently concluded, but we were really happy to see that it not only that it supported the youth throughout the years, 2 years specifically. They prevented school dropout, but also allowed them to think of the career paths that they wanted to have. And some of them chose to go towards vocational education, some of them to higher, to universities, so higher degrees. And this is, for instance, one way in which we decide to finance and to support cities with their investments in integration and inclusion. The other example, and I will stop here, is Nuremberg. In Nuremberg, we've got financing in support of schools and social housing. In discussions with the city and NOA, Norris Arbeit, a municipal company that is looking into labor inclusion, we have identified a particular group of vulnerable migrants and refugees who were, as they expressed it at the time, who had fallen among the cracks, in the sense that they had finished the civic integration courses. They have tried some jobs maybe, but they couldn't settle in and they didn't feel that they belong. So together with NOAA and with grant financing from the bank, we've launched a project that was built around a cafe in an area that was close to such a vulnerable group in Nuremberg, and where people could come with what they had. The concept was, it sounded better in German, but it basically consisted of people had various problems in settling in, that they could come to a place where they could meet language professors, language teachers, as well as social workers, and discuss their problems. And together they could find a solution. For instance, if housing was a problem, accessing to social housing was a problem, then they could advise them. If employment, I mean, they may have been nervous about getting a job or going through an interview, preparing an application, they were there to help them out. So in a nutshell, this is what the CEB does. We have been set up as an institution that would look into, in the wake of the Second World War, to find solutions for migrants, refugees, and displaced people. We are still doing that. The means have changed a little bit, and we try to adapt to the needs of cities and regions by going directly there, and not necessarily going through the national governments, but the focus has stayed the same.
Okay, thank you so much, Emilia Boeselager. these are, yeah, you also mentioned a lot of interesting details, and similar to what I said before, for the audience, please feel free to ask for details if you're interested. I would like to continue now with our fourth panelist already, I'm sorry, Niels. And yes, so Antje Groother spoke a lot about the positions of the Committee of the Regions, and you are the chair of the Migration and Integration Group for the Eurocities. So, and I know that for Eurocities, this demand for direct access to European funding has been a long-standing demand. Maybe you can give us your perspective on the discussion from the point of Eurocities and also from the point, of course, of the city of Amsterdam. The floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Melissa. Yeah, I thought I'd first delve a little bit into the experience of a city as a recipient of this funding. We are as a city well aware of the possibilities that EU funding brings, not only in the field of migration and integration, but also on other topics. On this field, the topic of migration, integration, we have had a number of positive experience with funding in the past couple of years. One, I'm not sure if it's mentioned already, it's a bit an outlier program, is the SERV program. The Citizenship, Equality and Rights and Values program. We used money for that for a collaborative project with other European cities on EU mobile citizens. So not so much migrants, refugees, but different types of migrants. There was also like a direct funding. We've used AMIF in the past, both direct funding as well as on the shared management. For example, values we did the last couple of years together with Eurocities and with other cities in Europe, which focused on working together with volunteering organizations and NGOs on the topic of refugee integration. The ESF funding is very important. That's also the shared management, like Anita Vella said. It's difficult sometimes to get funding through that. The topics and the priorities are often decided on the national level, which are not always the same as on the regional or the local level. As Groother also mentioned already, even within a member state, of course, there are differences between cities and regions. And the national government cannot cater to all the needs, of course. But we did use it for our Amsterdam approach to asylum status holders, even received the ESF award for that in 2016. And we also had some calls not honored, which we applied for. So it's not always every call you get the money. And I think that's maybe one of the less positive sides of the direct funding. There are not that many. Of course, there's quite an ample amount of money, but it's only divided over a number of projects and only a number of cities can partake in that, of course. So that's difficult to actually obtain the money sometimes. That's also one of the difficult things as a city, like how to go about getting a call honored. There's a lot of work, a lot of red tape, both before, during and after, a lot of administrative work. So that's one of the things that you really have to think about as a city as well. And now we are quite a big city with a team that focuses on European subsidies. But if you're a smaller municipality or an NGO, it's even more difficult often to really get the funding. But it's very useful as a city in Amsterdam. We're quite wealthy. We put a lot of our own money towards integration. So we don't always necessarily need the funding per se, but it can really help to do things that lie outside of the scope of your standing policies, to experiment, to do tryouts, to work together with more organizations within the city, but also other cities in Europe and other NGOs in Europe. So it really helps to build on your networks, build on knowledge, share exchanges of best practices. Because if you only focus on your own city, you start getting this tunnel vision, and it's very good to, through this funding, work together with other cities and keep improving your own policies. One of the difficult things also is, I think it's also mentioned in the policy brief, there's very often more short-term, ad hoc aims, like for 3 years. It's often very narrowly defined target groups. So either only refugees or either only local citizens or only EU mobile citizens. Well, especially in the field of integration, it's very important to include all of them. I mean, it's about human beings, and they have to work, they have to make use of healthcare, they go to school, they go at a social lives. So integration is a very broad spectrum, and you want to have people integrate in society and have society integrate newcomers. So you really have to include both parties very often to reach something. As Anita Vella also said, I think it's important to build on the past as well, to not only focus on more innovative approaches. This is very often one of the goals. Of course, it's important to keep improving, doing new things, trying out different policies. But very often there already are very good standing practices that are proven to work. And very often cities need extra money for capacity building or to continue doing the good work. Sometimes they can't do that, but have to do something new to obtain the money. So I think that's one of the focus points as well. Like, look at what's already, but works, what is proven to work, and try to keep building on that as well. One last thing, I will tell a bit more from the Eusebius perspective, maybe in the second part. But the ESF and AMIF, I think it's very important to try to tailor those more directly to local needs, and also see if you can maybe combine different funds. Now it's very often as well, it's very pillarized, very strict. You can do a project or a program which is funded by different streams of funding, and that sometimes hinders progress as opposed to the initial goals often of the funding, try to improve progress. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much, Niels Tübing. It connects very well, I think, to some of the points that Antje Groother has already mentioned, this kind of more needed flexibility, but also to some of the things that Emilia Boeselager presented. I think there was this idea at the European level as well to have some kind of inclusion blending facility where it would be possible to combine different kind of funds with grants and loans, but I'm not sure what the state of this is. Maybe Ms. Vella can say more on this in the round of discussion, but I think this is a very important point, this kind of like project short-term logic associated with the funds. We also know that one of the direct funding for a long time was European Urban Innovative Actions, and this specifically you had to present something new. You couldn't like build on like stuff that has other cities have done and kind of learn from best practices, but had to come up with like new and experimental designs. But I don't want to take up too much because now we have heard about the experience of the city of Bremen and the city of Amsterdam. Of course, very, let's say, big players at the city level. And I don't want to say that Grenoble is a small player, but I would really like to hear from you, Klaus Harpfast, what is the experience of Grenoble with European funds for integration and reception, and where do you see the challenges in accessing these? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Melissa. Thank you. Good evening to everybody. Indeed, Grenoble is a mid-sized city, 160,000 inhabitants. And it's in France. It's a country which is not very welcoming to migrants. You see pictures from Calais at the Channel Tunnel. You have seen the figures in the 2015 emergency. So it's on the national level, for national reasons, France is not very welcoming. So we are a welcoming city, or we try to be a welcoming city in a not very welcoming country. Just some figures in Grenoble, we are currently having about 400 migrants that we look after, that we try to integrate, that we host. And out of these 400, 200 have what I would call a legal status that allows them that they get subsidies from the national government. But the other half, the other 200, some would call them illegal. There is nothing such as an illegal migrant. They're only migrants. We call them as having a complex administrative status. So we look after them, and we don't get any money from the national government for looking after these migrants. The 400 in total have an annual cost of 2.5 million euro. And that is about 1% of our city's running expenditure budget. of which, of course, we get subsidies from the national government to have a net cost which is somewhat lower. And what we do is mostly provide housing. We have social housing. We also have city buildings or city-owned flats that are not used and where we can put up migrants. And we of course give subsidies to NGOs, local NGOs or charities that provide all the language and integration and inclusion activities of which previous speakers have been talking about. It's very important that we try to network in France that migrants have fundamental rights independent of their administrative status. So this is why we are also part of a French network, Anvita, of which my colleague Manu Carros is the vice chair at the national level. So 2.5 million, and we don't have in the past had any access to European funds to lower this charge. We do have in Grenoble been a candidate for an urban innovation action. We didn't get into it because typically you have about 50 to 100 candidates for one project that obtains funding. And we of course do get also from the cohesion funds and from the European Social Fund lots of funding, but as had been mentioned, these are under shared management, and the regulations that have been set up by the national government normally do not make possible that complex administrative status migrants, which are, you could call them without our help, would be homeless people, that these persons get support through these tools. However, I believe that the European Social Fund, because it is used practically everywhere in Europe by municipalities, by big ones like Bremen or Amsterdam, but also by mid-sized ones like Grenoble or even smaller ones, I believe that the way how the European social funds work is a good way to help municipalities, because it is based on the subsidizing a percentage of the overall cost. So the more you do, the more you get as a subsidy, but it also needs some contribution by the municipality. It is also having a monitoring function. So the commission or the government can see what happens with the money. And it is something that is available on a multi-annual basis. We in a small city, we cannot work with consecutive projects and calls to sustain a system of welcoming and integrating migrants that is beyond our financial reach. So if we want to build up a capacity in the long term or in the midterm and long term, we will need a tool that provides midterm and long-term funding. We accept monitoring, we accept rules, but we cannot set up something for 2 years, and in the next 2 years' lives, there is no money available anymore, and we have to tear it down. It's not good for the migrants, and it's not good for all the people who are in the NGOs, who are in the social housing, working to welcome these people and to integrate them. So this would be basically my recommendation from a small city or mid-sized city in Europe that nonetheless is Green European Capital in 2022. So maybe we can get our voice a little bit better heard, even in matters that are not directly linked to the Green European Capital. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Klaus Hapfast. Now we are already a bit we're running out of time, I would say. I suspected we would be done with the first round of questions a bit earlier. That's why I would suggest that the second round of questions, I will leave them more or less out and give all of you panelists the opportunity to react to each other or to react towards the important points that the other panelists have raised. And I think 6:15, we will then also open the discussion to questions from the audience. Thank you. And does anyone want to go first, reacting to each other, talking to the dear panelists? No? Okay.
If I may?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. So I am well, we actually are in full agreement with one of the points that Klaus made, in the sense that integration needs long-term planning and strategic planning. So in the financing that, for instance, that we allocate, we are doing best when there is a plan, a long-term plan on our partner side, which would normally be something along the lines of 7 years. This is what we noticed in our practice that works best, and it has the best outcome at the level of the of the migrants and refugees that we intend to serve. So having a long-term strategic planning is key when designing the funding and when implementing them. So as Klaus said, you can't think with it, and you can't really act with a 2-year horizon. That's a bit, it's counterproductive. Now, even if we, let's say, pride ourselves in providing long-term financing, so you can get you disperse the funds in something like 15 to 20 years, to give you an example, we still encounter difficulties in financing the operational costs. So we finance the infrastructure, let's say we do the social housing, but then when it comes to making the infrastructure work, where we would need some what we call soft measures, and I think the Commission uses the same term, to make sure that the housing is used by its intended beneficiaries and with the right outcomes. Then, because this is very seldom a cost that constitutes something that could be financed through a loan, according to financial regulations of the cities and regions that we work with, we cannot finance that. However, the way to work around it was that we mobilized grants. We also work with the European Commission. The European Union is one of our largest donors. So we try to innovate, but again, the grants are short term. So one possible way that we were thinking about to make funding work effectively for integration and inclusion purposes would be that the horizon is longer. So, and that there is a long-term commitment to have the budget in place, because it pays off. I won't go into that detail. And that would be all at this point from my side. There is a small announcement on a grant that we will make available, that we are working on with DG Home, but I leave that for later on.
Perfect, thank you. Niels, you raised your hand. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Yeah, maybe to add to what Klaus and Emily have been saying, I think it's very important, indeed, like the longer horizon. Like so integration is a very long project. It doesn't happen in 1, 2, or 3 years. It goes even like generations almost, maybe, and it's a bit difficult to fund, of course. But like a more horizon that's farther ahead, I think very important. And to that extent, I think it's also important that cities are more involved to discuss these horizons. What is exactly needed on that timeline to what you're working to? Not only like together, like with the Eurocities network, for example, like cities come together and they share, good practices, but also like needs, and they assess their needs, see what's needed, because they often have a long-term, long-standing experience and history as well with newcomers or migrants coming to their city. So both towards the national governments, the member states. When we talk about the shared management funding, the ESF, for example, in Netherlands, it's not always the same priorities. Local governments focus more on what is actually needed to help the people within the city. National governments seem to be more focusing on combating negative aspects of migration. It's a whole different narrative, of course, but also to work with the Commission or with other European institutions like the CEB. It's already mentioned, like the Partnership for Inclusion of Migrants and Refugees and the Urban Agenda. I think it's a wonderful example of that, where both member states and cities, the Commission, networks like Eurocities, but also CEB and other organizations all have a seat at the table in a non-hierarchical way, pretty much, and discuss, okay, what is needed both on the very practical local level, on the policy level, on the financial level. Like how can we together gauge all the needs that migrants have and that cities have, and try to come to new solutions. And I think it's important that this is a good example. I think this partnership to strengthen that, and maybe also do it in other levels as well, and really try to involve all the actors in this sense, and not only drop the lion's share of the money at the member states, but the lion's share of the involvement and responsibility lies at the cities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, very important. Thank you, Niels. We have 3 hands raised from our panelists, and we also, which is great, have already 6 questions from the audience. So I would ask you to keep it rather short, the points, so that we still have the possibility to discuss some of the questions from the audience. I think Anita Vella was first, and then Antje Grother, and then Klaus Hartfast. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to react a little bit to different points, to say 2 things. I mean, fully with you, and I hear you on the longer term planning. And I think this is why, I mean, it's important that these calls, on what we keep talking about, the thematic facility, but I believe, that the larger chunk of the funds, which is in shared management, we are really encouraging member states authorities that are our, let's say, main counterparts in the negotiations of those programs, to build those programs up with you and with the regions. And this is really now the moment, so it's a little bit either now or never. Sounds a little bit drastic, but we are really in the phase of starting a 7-year programming period and implementing it. So it's important that we keep this in mind. And then, looking as well at other funds. I mean, I think a lot of you mentioned it. AMIF, it's key, it's our fund, DigiHome, etc. But it's also, when you compare it to the amount invested in the European Social Fund and what that can do, and the ERDF, when I hear about housing infrastructure, there's a lot that can be tapped into, from that angle. And I think at the local level, if you zoom in, it's easier to see how this comes together. So I think you are in a way at the forefront, maybe to help, let's say, the member states level, to see that how that funding comes together, on the ground in practice. Yeah, and then there was a question from the chat earlier that I can take, but I let you, Marisa, tell me when. And yeah. I think you're muted. I cannot hear you. Yeah.
Yes, a major error that I should have learned by now. Yes, please answer to the question directly. I mean, I think that's fine. It's about when the calls are coming out, I think. Is that the question that you wanted to reply to?
No, it was something else that I saw before. It was about, yes, whether we include migrants' views in our policy design. And I think that's important. And we actually have a specific expert group on the views of migrants, so we have a group of around 30 people, representing different communities, migrant background, etc. And this has been excellent. And they have been involved in designing the action plan, and we have regular discussions. So I think it's definitely, it's a good point, and we are trying, let's say, as much as we can on that front. And then on the timing of the calls, I think I said it in my intervention, this will be March, April, so we are working on issuing this in the coming months.
Okay, thank you so much. And I think that's a very important raised point, that often people who are directly affected by these policies, which are migrants and refugees, are often not really represented in those discussions. But we were, before the Q&A session, and Antje Grother and Klaus Hartfast also wanted to make a few points. And then I promised that we will take the questions of the audience that are still left over.
Thank you, Marisa. Ich versuche es kurz zu machen. Ich habe das vorhin schon angesprochen, dieses Netzwerk Städte und Regionen für die Integration von Migrantinnen und Migranten. in dem fast 160 Städte zusammengeschlossen sind. Unter denen haben wir eine Umfrage gemacht und haben gefragt, was nutzt ihr eigentlich an europäischen Fonds? Und da kam eben leider raus, dass die absolut größte Mehrheit überhaupt keine dieser Fonds nutzt, um selber ihre Arbeit damit zu betreiben. Also nur 13,7% von denen haben zum Beispiel vom AME profitiert. Ja, nur 8% aus ESF und nur 2% aus EFRE. Also das scheint auch in den lokalen und regionalen Gebietskörperschaften eine gewisse Scheu davor zu geben, sich in diesen Fonds zu bewegen, zumal es ja auch in der Antragsversion nicht ganz einfach ist. Und eben alle haben gesagt, der Verwaltungsaufwand ist ihnen zu groß und sie haben kein extra Personal, das sich darum kümmert. Da beißt sich dann, wie man auf Deutsch sagt, die Katze in den Schwanz. Ja, also wenn ich kein Personal habe, das sich um das Geld kümmert, habe ich kein Geld, das ich ausgeben kann, von dem ich vielleicht auch Personal bezahlen kann. Und das ist ein Punkt, an dem wir immer wieder starten, dass wir sagen, es gibt Projektmittel, aber es ist dann zu kurzfristig. Für strukturelle Veränderungen braucht man Personal, das diese Veränderungen begleitet. Das kann nicht aus Projektmitteln finanziert werden. Und da kommen dann immer die Länder und die Mitgliedstaaten ins Spiel, die diese Verfahren dann auch unterstützen müssen, aber das oft nicht tun. Aber es ist eben für eine kleine Stadt unglaublich kompliziert, selbst Anträge zu stellen auf europäischer Ebene. Und dann kommt häufig dazu, dass eine Kofinanzierung gesichert werden muss. Auch das ist ein weiteres Problem, an dem man anfassen muss. Und ein wichtiger Punkt ist die Frage, werden wir merken, dass ein Projekt nicht läuft? Sag mal, es gibt einen Fall, es funktioniert einfach nicht, das Design stimmt nicht. Dann gibt es unglaublich große Angst zu sagen, es läuft nicht, wir machen was anderes, weil alle sofort Angst haben, die Gelder zu verlieren. Das führt dazu, dass man an Projekten festhält, die, ich sag mal, doof sind, ja, damit das Geld bestehen bleibt, damit das Geld, was schon mal da ist, wenigstens bleibt, bevor man was Neues macht. Und ich würde auch gerne auf die Frage umgehen, wie bezieht man eigentlich die zu uns kommen, mit ein, und würde 2 konkrete Bremer Beispiele einfach geben. Der eine ist der Bremer Rat für Integration, den gibt es schon seit 2005. Der ist gegründet worden, um die Integration von Menschen mit Migrationshintergrund zu stärken, und zwar jenseits der Frage, ob sie als Geflüchtete zu uns kommen oder ob sie als Arbeitnehmerinnen und Arbeitnehmer zu uns kommen oder als auszubildende Studierende, weil ganz viele Fragen müssen für alle gemeinsam beantwortet werden. Der Ämterdschungel. Wie finde ich mich eigentlich im deutschen Verwaltungswesen zurecht? Die Frage, wie lerne ich die Sprache so, dass ich Chance habe auf einen Arbeitsplatz? Und ganz viele von denen, die sich dort engagieren, sind Leute, die selber diese Erfahrung 10 oder 20 Jahre vorher gemacht haben, die ganz konkret helfen und ganz konkret dann sich einzelnen Leuten an die Seite stellen können. Und die Frage, was Migrantinnen und Migranten wollen, unterscheidet sich nicht von dem, was die wollen, die hier schon länger leben. Wir alle wollen ein sicheres Leben, wir alle wollen eine Arbeit, die unsere Familie ernährt, und wir wollen uns zu Hause fühlen. Und darauf kommt es an, wenn man diese Programme strickt, dass das hinterher möglich ist. Danke.
Yeah, very importantly, and I think this was raised earlier on, also the question of inclusion versus integration, and this point that you mentioned, it's like a very holistic view on integration that always covers the whole community, and it's not only about migrants and refugees. Klaus Hafast, you also wanted to add points, and maybe I might ask you if you already can reply to one of the questions of the chat as well, because I think that was also a point that you have mentioned earlier, people with irregular or undocumented status, and what is actually possible in terms of funding for across these different categories that are of course made by states. And I think one of you panelists said it, we are all human beings, and these categorizations are of course forced up on us. But what is possible in terms of funding from your perspective, and also of course make your point that you wanted to make? Thank you.
Thanks. At the moment in France, very little is possible. We basically have to use our city money, which we have a right to use, to help the undocumented or migrants with complex administrative status. An example is, for example, and this was one of the questions in the chat, the Uber migrants, people whom I will certainly cross when I cycle back home in half an hour or so. I will see them on their e-bikes delivering food. many of these are part of these undocumented migrants. And it is very important, because they do survive very badly, but they survive. It's very important that we help them with access to fundamental rights, access to healthcare, access also to housing. And we have made the experience that it is very important to have points where they can come to, which are not what I would call administrations. So we are now looking, for example, to put in our city libraries points where they can then approach the city administration. Library is a cultural activity, and you don't feel getting into a police or administrative building when you go into a library. So we will then see whether we can provide in these places advice, help, and access to fundamental rights. And the point I wanted to make is that in the ESF and in the cohesion funds, the documents for programs have been written, and the word migrant is not in these documents. And don't be surprised if the applications for ESF and cohesion funds don't concern migrants, because it has not been written into the French documents that funding is available for migrants. And that means that when the instruction is done, documents that name other parts of the people who are living in France will, of course, get preference. It would be really important that if the EU wants to fund specific activities by cities for migrants, that the tool within the ESF or the cohesion funds, like it has been done for the poor areas in cities, with what we call ETE in France, that this is specifically outspoken that this money or this percentage of the overall fund is earmarked for migrant-related activities.
Thank you, Klaus. Then I would like to pose one more question. Yeah, probably this question goes directly to Mrs. Vella. Since the question is, since mid, large and small municipalities apparently often lack capacity to successfully apply, is there a kind of a help desk or similar within the Commission, or something similar within the Commission that could help those with their application? And if no, is there a possibility to establish a supporting office like this? I mean, this relates also a bit to questions that have been posted in the chat on, like, when will be the calls published? What kind of different calls and programs are available for different types of categories of migrants? As I said, always, yeah. Thank you.
You want me to come in, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, I mean, good question. I mean, we have specific, you know, when these calls are launched, and I might sound bureaucratic, but there is a specific procedure. So this is, you know, they're put on the website, and then there's a possibility for potential, you know, interested applicants to ask questions, you know, online. So it has to be, you know, an equal process that the applicants get the right information. So there's this whole side of it. But as I said before, you know, we also plan to do like an info session after we launch the call, which would be in the form of a webinar like this, of this kind, you know. So this is our plan for this call. There is no intention to have a dedicated help desk, I have to say, for the moment, because our capacities are rather limited as a unit, but I hope that at least this webinar can clarify specific things on this upcoming call.
Yes, thank you very much. I mean, this is always the difficulty of such a panel, because there's, of course, a bit the political side of the debate on, like, the general yeah, let's say, tension between the local level and interests of member states. That definitely also plays a role in the programming of the funding. We also heard that there's a very, there are different types of regions, that there are very diverse views, and even within member states. And we also know that some member states have difficulties in distributing the funds altogether. We probably all know which member states I'm speaking of. We have not touched so much up on this. We have discussed a bit more on the, yeah, let's say, practical side of what is possible now and how the debate has developed. And I have one last very specific question from Nina Opkes. She used to work in Utrecht, if I'm correct. And she has a question to Emilia Postolake in how to what extent CEB could support migrants, I think from Central Europe. I don't know if CE is that's the correct abbreviation, with regard to social housing. I'm not sure if I get, yeah, I hope you understand the question. It's written like this, more or less, in the chat.
Yes, so the support that we do, so we can work in any of the 42 member states that I have shown initially on the map. This includes countries that are not yet EU countries, EU member states. And we do cover social housing in our, let's say, activities. The focus is on getting the infrastructure ready. So,
okay, perfect.
More information you can find on the website, or you can contact me if you want something more specific.
Thank you so much. I think we have covered more or less all the questions from the chat. I hope we have covered them in a way that satisfies our audience. We are almost at the end, but I would like to give each panelist 1 minute for like closing remarks, maybe a bit on the perspective, what is now needed and what is the way forward. And I would start with the person that was the last for the first inputs. So this would be Klaus. And please, yeah, take not more than a minute. Thank you.
Thank you. I think I've made my points, and I will leave my time for others who might need more than a minute.
Perfect. Thank you. Then let's go with Niels.
Thank you, Klaus. Very generous, but I won't take up any extra time. I think maybe to add a little bit to what Klaus said before, the notion of migrants being included in the different funding, and also maybe to refer a bit to questions on COVID and the recovery now. I think it's very important, not only in the funding we have been talking about, but also in the recovery fund and the just transition fund and the whole energy transition, that we also take into account migrants, newcomers, people with low income, to really make sure that it's really a solidarity happening within Europe. Maybe to hark back to Schumann's Solidarité de fait, and really try to implement it within the cities and in the member states, and also from the Commission, that really make sure that it doesn't only go to the big companies, but make sure everyone working, whether it's like language learning, new skills learning, housing, make sure that everyone will be covered under this recovery and the transition.
Thank you. Then Antje Rother.
Thank you so much. The last point I wanted to make is that integration and inclusion works both ways. So if we do it right, it works for the people already here for longer years, as well as for the people incoming. Yeah, so we have to do it both ways. We share the same streets, we share the same schools, we share universities, I don't know, parks, even shops, whatever. So if you do that right, people stick together, people make friends, and people are integrated in both ways. So we have the situation that we have new cultures incoming, and we can learn from them, and they also can learn from us. So we have, I think it benefits us. This is a win-win situation, and to make that possible, you need money, but you also need people who engage in that, people who are willing to read all the commentaries on fundings and how to do that. Take the webinars, take all the schools they can have for applying for money, so things work together, and then we can profit all from that.
Thank you. Last words from, who wants to go first? Anita Vella and then Emilia Postulac. I hope that's fine.
Thank you. No, what I would say as a final message is multi-stakeholder approach. I think this is really, for us, it sounds like a bureaucratic and big word again, but the essence of it is really that we need to work together governance-wise, with all different layers and people around us. And definitely, funding is important, but also putting the funding where the policy is, and vice versa, and also looking at the different levels. And that's why for me, the partnership with the Committee of the Regions and with yourselves, Mrs. Groter, I think this is key, and everything has to come together to make it work for the stakeholders on the ground. So this is my message.
Thank you. Emilia Boeselager. Thanks.
Thank you. So as a last word from my side, as we all know, migrants are not a homogeneous group, and they often require tailored responses, while the receiving communities may face their own specific challenges. So it's a bit the two-way street that Antje rightly mentioned. What we are looking for, and Niels talked about the partnership for inclusion, is to have, as a financier, is to have a forum or several fora where migrants and refugees are there to speak up their concerns and are involved in the multi-stakeholder, multi-governance partnerships that Anita talked about. That would be all from my side.
Thank you so much. Then I can only thank my panelists for a very interesting and fruitful discussion. And actually, we could discuss even for a longer time, I think, but unfortunately, we're at the end. And I want to thank also the audience that most of them actually stayed with us until the end. Thank you so much. Have a nice evening wherever you are, and hopefully see you again in a different format around these topics, maybe at some point live if the pandemic is finally over. Yes, thank you. And normally you would say get home safely, but now I would just say good night.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks to you, everyone.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye. Have a nice
Bye.
evening.
Ciao.
Bye-bye.